Hey, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Eliza Lustig, and I'm on the National Climate Assessment Team at the U.S. Global Change Research Program, or USGCRP. I am joined today by several of the authors from the Northern Great Plains chapter who will present their webinar. But before we get started, I want to draw your attention to a note that is in the chat. Microphones are disabled for all participants today, but if you have questions or comments throughout today's session, please enter them in the chat. We're going to do Q&A at the end of the presentation. If you have any technical difficulties, please contact Tia Biggs, who is our technical support person today. And please note that all participants are expected to be respectful and considerate towards others per the US GCRP Code of Conduct. Next slide, please. Alrighty, so I'm going to kick off the webinar with some background information about the National Climate Assessment before turning it over to the Northern Great Plains chapter authors. So let's begin by talking about USGCRP. The Global Change Research Program was mandated by Congress in the Global Change Research Act of 1990 to do, as it says here, to assist the nation and the world to understand, assess, predict, and respond to human-induced and natural processes of global change. So the program convenes 15 agencies to advance climate and global change science and to provide useful and usable information to decision makers across the country. Next slide, please. Okay, so the same law that established the program also mandates a periodic scientific assessment that is known as the National Climate Assessment, or as the NCA. So the NCA is a quadrennial report that analyzes the effects of global change on several sectors. Those are also listed here: natural environment, agriculture, energy, land and water resources, transportation, human health, social systems, and biodiversity. The program is charged with assessing current trends, so history up until the present, as well as projections for the next 25 to 100 years. The NCA is used by organizations and individuals for a variety of purposes, including national policy making, risk management in the private sector, local mitigation and adaptation planning, as well as by practitioners, utility managers, educators, and many, many others. Next slide, please. Okay, so now let's get some more into specifics. So NCA authors review a large body of scientific research from diverse information sources. They then synthesize that information and examine the confidence in their scientific understanding. And they also are evaluating uncertainties, so what they know and what they don't know. NCA5 was written by 500 authors and 260 technical contributors from every state in the nation, as well as from Puerto Rico, the US Virgin Islands, Guam, Palau, and Micronesia. The NCA is designed to be policy relevant. So we're asking authors to distill findings into accessible language. We're asking them to frame their findings in terms of risk to people and to important resources. That said, the report is strictly not policy prescriptive, so we are not advocating for a particular viewpoint or a policy measure. To that end, we are using a range of projections, future projections, to help decision makers understand the fullest possible extent of risk that could be avoided or reduced under a different scenario. And then we're leaving it up to the decision makers to determine their risk threshold. Again, not telling people what to do, but leaving it up to the user. Of course, the assessment is compliant with all applicable federal laws and policies. So that includes the Global Change Research Act, but it also includes a whole suite of other laws that govern things like information quality, accessibility, transparency, etc. And then finally, the report process involves a very extensive review. As I'm sure our authors would attest, it includes several opportunities for public engagement, a review by the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, and several government science reviews. Next slide, please. Okay, so now let's look at the NCA5 table of contents. Like previous NCAs, NCA5 covers national level topics, regions, and response. So the report opens with an overview, and that is followed then by 2 chapters dedicated to the physical Earth system changes in the context of climate change. Then there are the national topic chapters 10 regional chapters, of course, including the Northern Great Plains, and 2 response chapters, although I want to make sure to emphasize that response actions are also discussed throughout the report, not just, excuse me, in these 2 chapters alone. This table of contents has evolved quite a bit over time, and that's been informed in part by user input. So NCA5 actually added 2 new chapters, one on economics and one on social systems and justice, highlighted here in blue. We also have 5 new focused features, and those are on compound extreme events, Western wildfire, COVID-19, supply chains, and blue carbon. We also have several appendices, including a new one dedicated to indicators. So now that we have gone through some of that introductory background, it is my pleasure to introduce Glenn Guntersbergen, who is the federal coordinating lead of the Northern Great Plains chapter. Glenn and our fellow authors will lead us through the remainder of the webinar today. So over to you, Glenn. Thank you very much.
Thank you. As Lisa said, my name is Glenn Guntersbergen. I'm a research ecologist with the U.S. Geological Survey, and along with the other lead authors, Corey Knapp, the chapter lead from the University of Wyoming, and Doug Kluck, the federal coordinating lead author from NOAA. I want to acknowledge the exceptional author team that was pulled together for this chapter that includes individuals from academia, federal agencies, sovereign tribal nations, and NGOs with expertise across the topics and the sectors of critical importance to residents of the region. And in this presentation, you'll be hearing from a subset of those authors. Next slide, please. Our chapter is organized around 5 key messages. And key messages are the conclusions based on the author team's expert judgment and synthesis of the available literature on the topic for this region. These key messages present findings in the context of risk to both natural and human systems. And an important part of the key messages is an assessment of the scientific confidence and the certainty associated with our findings, our observations, and our projections. Next slide, please. Our chapter covers the states of Montana, Wyoming, Nebraska, and South and North Dakota. And in this chapter, we assess current and future risks by climate change and provide detailed discussions of region-specific challenges, adaptations, opportunities, and even success stories for managing risks and impacts. How the region is impacted and responds to these climatic challenges is influenced by its unique low population density, its rural nature, dependence on natural resources, and its status as a commodity exporter, which also makes it open to the influence from external markets and policies. So I'd like to now move into the key messages. And so if we could have the next slide, please. And we'll let Barb and Karen introduce themselves.
Hi, I'm Karen Ryberg. I'm from the U.S. Geological Survey. Key message 1 sets the stage for the other key messages, which delve into the impacts of key message 1 and how the region is responding to change. The Northern Great Plains has always been a region prone to climate extremes, and we expect that to continue. The region is experiencing unprecedented changes related to climate, including severe droughts, increases in hail frequency and size, floods, wildfire. Rising temperatures across the region are expected to lead to increased evapotranspiration, as well as greater variability in precipitation. For more on these statements and the science behind them, I'd like to point you to the traceable accounts accessible from the online chapter. The traceable accounts describe the evidence base, major uncertainties, and research gaps, and a more detailed description of how we determined the confidence and likelihood in this and other key messages. That is the italicized portion in the key messages. The next few slides present figures illustrating key message 1. Next slide.
Hi, I'm Barb Mays-Bousted from the NOAA's National Weather Service, and I'll talk about the next couple of slides. Across the Northern Great Plains region, our temperature is warming, but you'll notice that there's a gradient of warming from east to west. And current and projected values will demonstrate those distinctive gradients with implications then for the climate impacts and for effective adaptation. In these maps, by the way, white areas are large water bodies. Floods and droughts are expected to continue to be part of the experience of living in the Northern Great Plains, as they always have been, underlying that pattern, is this increase in temperature. And this has implications for both evapotranspiration and for soil moisture. Next slide, please. We'll illustrate with soil moisture here, showing the current and projected changes for the summer months under an intermediate scenario on the left and a very high scenario on the right. Soil moisture is expected to decrease slightly throughout the region in the summer months, with the largest decreases in the western mountain ranges of Montana. An increase in southwestern Wyoming is projected under both the intermediate and very high scenarios. Although not illustrated here, you can find more information in our chapter on these next couple of points. Snow water equivalent is decreasing at higher elevations in the Northern Great Plains. See our figure 4.5 in chapter 4. And that can contribute to the lower soil moisture in these areas. Those declines in soil moisture can lead to crop, forest, and rangeland plant water stress. They can reduce plant growth and increase the ecosystem's susceptibility to fire. The early snowmelt, the decreasing soil moisture, and the increasing aridity all contribute to an increased potential for wildfire, with increases in both wildfire numbers and season length. And drought, too, is projected to increase in the region. We additionally addressed hail trends in our region as our stakeholder engagement indicated that it was a topic of high concern, particularly with our agriculture and ranching stakeholders, but also related to property damage. And emerging research indicates trends toward more frequent large hail days and a lengthened hail season in the Northern Great Plains region. Next slide.
So this map shows distinct differences in east-west trends in annual peak stream flow, a proxy for flooding, where the size of the dot is relative to the size of the trend. Red dots are downward trends or general decreases in the magnitude of peak stream flow, although you may still get large floods. And blue dots are upward trends. These trends highlight the demarcation line between the humid east and arid west, traditionally defined by the 100th meridian. With the decreasing trend areas in the west, we still expect to experience floods, and we'll still expect to experience droughts in the eastern part. The Missouri River transects the region and is emblematic of complex intergovernmental relations that will become increasingly important under climate change. Record floods in 2011 and 2019 cost billions in damages. Research suggests that these floods were caused by natural variability within the system. However, model simulations suggest that climate change will reduce runoff in the upper Missouri basin. On to key message 2.
So thank you, and I'm Rob Byron. I'm a physician and internist who's practiced in southern Montana for over 35 years. It's hard to talk about climate change without talking about human health. One of the stronger messages in NCA5 throughout many of the chapters is that climate change is already impacting our health in a variety of ways. And that is discussed in more detail in specific chapters on human health, air quality, and water quality. But in the Northern Great Plains, we think that climate-related hazards that were discussed earlier, such as drought, wildfire, and flooding, are already harming our physical, mental, and spiritual health, as well as the ecological health of the region. And as the climate changes, it's expected to have increasing and cascading negative effects on human health and on the lands, waters, and species of people in this area. Next slide, please. And one of the important aspects in the Northern Great Plains is that much of our population is rural, and we have large numbers of indigenous tribes, many living on either reservations or others. So climate change in military parlance is described as a threat amplifier. And certainly that's what we are seeing. In terms of human health, the mental aspects and spiritual aspects are especially concerning and often unrecognized. Things such as solastalgia, which is the loss of people's environments or the feeling of loss of their environment, even though they still live in the same location because of environmental change. And of course, across the Northern Great Plains and other areas, increased impacts from wildfire smoke, heat, and vector and waterborne diseases. And as we've noted, these rarely happen, particularly extreme weather events, in isolation. We see earlier snowmelt with flooding, which also can lead to problems with waterborne illnesses and others, and often is followed by droughts during the summer with all the risks of that. Next slide, please, and I will turn it over to Karen for discussion of this.
In key message 2, we investigated ecological health from several aspects, including water quality and cascading impacts to biodiversity loss. For water quality, there are hypotheses about the effect of climate change, but supporting some of those hypotheses with observations and research has been challenging because of gaps in monitoring, lack of some forms of long-term data, and changes in laboratory and remote sensing methods. I encourage you to visit the traceable accounts for this key message as well to find out more about those gaps. This figure shows acreage in the Northern Great Plains region where at least 50% of the soil surface is covered by 2 representative invasive plant species, cheatgrass in the western part of the region and Kentucky bluegrass or Canada bluegrass in the eastern part of the region. The figure shows acreage for 2004 to 2010 in the center panel and 2011 to 2015 in the bottom panel, as well as the change in extent of invasion between the 2 periods in the top panel. These invasive grasses already pose a threat to biodiversity, and climate change is predicted to increase invasive species challenges. On to key message 3.
Hello, everyone. I'm Jackie Ott. I'm a research ecologist with the Rocky Mountain Research Station based in Rapid City, South Dakota. And key message 3 is that resource and land-based livelihoods are at risk. The Northern Great Plains region is heavily reliant on agriculture and resource-based economies, placing livelihoods at risk from the impacts of climate change and related policy. Agriculture and recreation will see some positive effects, but primarily negative effects related to changing temperature and precipitation regimes. Energy sector livelihoods will be affected as emissions reductions policies drive shifts away from fossil fuel sources. Climate change is expected to test the adaptive resilience of the region's residents, in particular rural, indigenous, and low-income immigrant populations. Next slide, please. So I divided these out into the 4 different groups: the agriculture, tourism and recreation, energy, and then looking at social vulnerability. So starting off with agriculture. With those increased temperatures that Barb and Karen showed, we're going to have a lengthening of the growing season and frost-free periods, which is going to benefit crop production. However, there will be heat and moisture stress during that seed production time period when we're producing our yield or crop yield, and that's going to result in reduced yields. However, and like we can also see with some of this summer heat, it's delayed the harvest of some of our key indigenous plants, such as choke cherries or wild turnips and some other medicinal plants. So when you look at this map, this is showing you where our cropland is versus where our rangeland is. So the more green it is, the more cropland it is. The farther west you go, the more pure grassland used for rangeland is. And you can see that where it's greener, that's where our precipitation is generally above 20 inches per year. And our cropland has been expanding into these less productive areas where annual precipitation is less than would you desire. And that's making crops more likely to experience failure when we hit those heat stress moments in the summer. Shifts in cultivars and management practices and crop mixes may offer some solutions. So our rangelands, switching over to those, host a vast livestock production system. And what do you need for livestock and wildlife? You need forage, food for them to eat. And you care about the amount and the quality of this forage. The increased growing season length and the increased carbon assimilation is going to lead to increased forage availability, but it's also going to decrease that forage quality. And however, when you have drought, which is also projected to increase in our region, you're going to have yields that we're going to have less forage, but higher forage quality because you're concentrating those nutrients. However, rangeland productivity in our region may see less of an effect of climate change than livestock producing regions elsewhere, and we're going to kind of be a haven. Next slide. Thanks. So tourism and rec, let's go to those. They're an important source of revenue for our region. We all appreciate outdoor activities, I think, living in this region. Public lands often host a large majority of our tourism and recreation in our region. For example, a lot of our ski resorts have long-term leases on Forest Service lands. Water is a limited resource, and drought can really impact our water-based activities such as fishing and boating. We've had increased wildfire activity in the region and outside of the region that has impacted our air quality and visibility, which also all in turn impact tourism. We've all experienced our smoky days here. Drought can negatively impact hunting, as we saw in 2017, reductions in pheasant populations. Warm winters will decrease the winter sports season. We're going to shorten that winter sports season, but there might be increased opportunities for those shoulder season activities such as wildlife viewing or hunting. Next slide, please. Moving on to energy, we all use energy, and energy demand in our region is expected to shift. With our warmer winters, we're expected to have, we're going to reduce our demands for heating. Warmer summers, we're going to increase our demands for cooling. You might see a reduction in your electricity bills, but you also might see increases or stability in that bill because natural gas is getting traded out for electrification for our energy grid. We are an energy-rich region. Several of our states are net energy exporters to the rest of the country. As you can see in this figure, we have oil and gas, we have coal, we have wind resources throughout the region. And the high demand for oil and gas has expanded the extraction and grown the associated communities. Our shifts due to policy from coal to renewable energy is causing a shift in energy livelihoods in the region. Wind electricity generation has tripled in the past decade. And the energy demands from outside the region and the national policies are going to drive energy development within our region. Next slide, please. So social vulnerability to environmental hazards. We are a rural region. We have a large rural population. We have multiple tribes and immigrant populations tied to agriculture. There have been multiple extreme events, as Barb and Karen mentioned, with drought, hail, floods, wildfire. And although I like to think we have a resilient spirit, these events are really affecting our communities, especially those that have a greater exposure and sensitivity to these hazards, and those communities that have fewer resources to either prepare for these events or respond and adapt to these events. You can think of the flooding in 2018 on Pine Ridge and the slow rebuild following that, the lack of infrastructure creating water insecurity in Indigenous communities. We also have a higher percentage overall of mobile homes than the national average, and these homes are more vulnerable to these types of disasters. So next slide, please. So when you put all these different, resources collectively into a figure, you see how we have the overlap, and you're going to start seeing tensions and trade-offs between all these uses. And that is the feature of our next key message.
Thanks. I'm Aparna Bomsai-Dodson, and I work for the U.S. Geological North Central Climate Adaptation Science Center, and I'm here to discuss key message 4. And as Jackie mentioned, one of the things that we wanted to discuss in our chapter was that climate change is creating new and exacerbating existing tensions and trade-offs between land use, water availability, ecosystem services, and other considerations in the region, leading to decisions that are expected to benefit some and set back others. Decision makers are navigating a complicated landscape of shifting demographics, policy and regulatory tensions, and barriers to action. Changes in temperature and precipitation averages, extremes, and seasonality will alter the productivity of working lands, resulting in land use shifts to alternative crops or conversion to grasslands. Shifts in energy demand, production, and policy will change land use needs for energy infrastructure. And in the chapter, we discussed a few different examples of how these tensions and trade-offs are playing out in the region. One that we're already seeing is how higher temperatures and a longer growing season make the region attractive for climate-driven human migration and increased forage production, which in turn increases the demand for water resources. However, we also know shifts in precipitation reductions in snowpack will alter the quantity and timing of available water, and these tensions culminate in difficult decisions about how best to manage water quantity and quality and balance trade-offs between consumptive and ecological uses. On this slide is another example where we show how to counterbalance the potentially negative effects of a warmer future climate and drier soils. We may see a shift to more water conservative and nutrient retentive land cover, such as a shift from row crops to grassland. This could enhance ecosystem services such as wildlife and biodiversity, flood retention, nutrient stabilization, and carbon sequestration, and it could increase resilience. However, it would also require many societal and infrastructure adjustments and investments, including identifying seed sources for native species. So one short-term strategy for managers in the region could be to focus on conversion of agriculture to grassland in areas that will become marginal for production under future climate change. And now I'm going to turn it over to key message 5.
Thank you, and thanks for being here today with us. My name is Corey Knapp, and I'm an associate professor at the University of Wyoming, and I was the chapter lead for this chapter. And I'm going to share with you today key message 5, which is our last key message, and has to do with what communities, tribal nations, and agencies are currently doing in our region to adapt and transform to these impacts that are being felt across the region. So adaptation is underway in the Northern Great Plains to address the effects of climate change. Agricultural communities are shifting toward climate adaptation measures such as innovative soil practices, new drought management tools, and water use partnerships. Several tribal nations are leading efforts to incorporate traditional knowledge and governance into their adaptation plans, and resource managers are increasingly relying on tools such as scenario planning to improve the adaptive capacity of natural ecosystems. And I want to just share with you a few brief case studies that we included in the chapter. I won't share all of them with you, but first off, in Nebraska, we're seeing the NRCS, the Natural Resource Conservation Service, leading efforts to increase soil health with farmers and ranchers. And so they're testing soil health management practices, which can be a benefit for water holding capacity, infiltration, and carbon sequestration. And oftentimes this is happening through producer networks, so farmers sharing practices with other farmers. We're also seeing restoration of perennial grasslands. So in North Dakota, there are efforts to return less productive cropland to native perennial cover. And across the region, we're seeing restoration of buffalo by tribal sovereign nations within our region as a way to improve the resilience of ecosystems, culture, and communities. We are also seeing a lot of drought planning happening within the region, and as we said, the integration of traditional knowledge into climate adaptation planning. In terms of flood response, we're also seeing some stimulation of local response efforts like the White Swan Recovery Group, which was the Sioux tribe near Lake Andes National Wildlife Refuge in South Dakota. And we've seen other mutual aid groups that have come together to help people respond to flooding risk. Next, I just want to share with you a tool that's being used in our region by the National Park Service. So this is a tool called scenario-based planning, and it's a way for agencies such as the National Park Service to help them navigate and manage uncertainty in their planning efforts. So on the right-hand side, you can see forecast planning, where you plan for one given future instead of looking at the multitude of options of what the future might look like. On the left-hand side, you see the National Park Service looking at different options or different scenarios of what the future might look like in order to do more robust planning and take into account all of the potential futures that could happen. And in the Northern Great Plains, this approach has been utilized in the Badlands, Wind Cave, Devil's Tower, and several other National Park Service units, and is a useful tool for helping people think about the future and how to manage in it. And with that, that is the end of our official presentation for you today, and I will turn it over for the question and answer period.